So Professor Yu, could you make a suggestion to our top leaders or authorities? We stop direct election at the grassroots level, because so many corruption happened. I told him, no way. Why internal logic of development? We have to resolve these problems by law, and then we can only way from the village level develop our democracy from village level, gradually to township level, to county level, to provincial level. So there's a necessary change. Finally, impact of globalization. So these four basic reasons, even I often told in China of our senior officials, I ask them, you can you can make a different opinion, even can criticize my view, but I don't think they're necessary. Of course, Chinese democracy is its own model. So now the problem is a hot debate between China and the Western. According to Western typical criteria, especially such as the multi-party competition system, or universal direct election of top leaders, or separation of legislature, judicial, and executives, maybe you can say China has no democracy, because the top leader from Mr. Deng Xiaoping to now President Hu Jintao always say, we never copy and follow Western democracy model. But if you change the perspectives, if you look at the political development in China since the reform, in terms of public participation, transparency, rule of law, then you can find so many obvious progress even in our politics towards democracy. Maybe I took a little longer, so.
Yeah. That's fine. No, thank you. Very interesting. Well, I think, before too long, we want to open it up to see if some people in the audience have questions for the panelists. But let me quickly follow up on just a couple of things first while you're thinking about questions you might want to ask, because I think that issue of grassroots pressure for change in China is another specialty of my friend Cheng Li. His new volume just came out, is China's Emerging Middle Class, about the remarkably rapid and vibrant development of an urban middle class in China. And I think one question that has been on people's minds for many years is, when you see a real formation of a middle class in the cities, to what extent are those people going to be a source of demand and pressure for real structural change in the Chinese political system? Or, on the other side, are they maybe a force for some sort of conservative stability in China? How do you see that unfolding?
When you and I were in Shanghai in early or mid-1990s, and we witnessed the early stage of a rise of middle class in Shanghai. At that time, people were very cynical about the so-called concept of middle class. But now I think that concept has been widely accepted in China and also outside China. The middle class has been kind of an ally for the Chinese government for the very reason of stability. But in the recent years, things start to change in my observation. You mentioned about the 6.6 million college graduates. As we know, that about 30% of them could not find a job. And largely because of rapid expansion of the higher education system. Most of these college graduates come from the middle class family, and they all will become the future middle class members. So if we cannot find job, it's a serious challenge. Even they can find job, they cannot afford buying housing or a housing unit. And there's a joke in China saying that if you are recent graduates, if you live in Hangzhou, Suzhou, or Fuzhou, not to mention Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen. If you want to buy a small unit, you should start to do saving since the Tang Dynasty 1,000 years ago. And also, finally, this is based on Chinese official statistics. The admission rate for civil service working in the government as a low-level official, the admission rate was about 1.6%. In some jobs, like the State Energy Bureau, one position, 8,000 people apply for a job. There's a serious problem. And it's also revealed the private sector is not doing well. 10 years ago, many of them could find jobs in the private sector. Very few people wanted to go to the government. But now that door also become narrow and narrow. Professor Yu mentioned about the 1911 revolution. As we know that, of course, the contributing factor for 1911 revolution are multiple. But one of them was that 6 years earlier China abolished the Kejüzi, the national examination system, which recruited gentries and the scholar official class. So that could provide a reason for people to become revolutionary. So I think that's a clear message when we talk about current stage. Of course, China changed remarkably during the past century. But you mentioned about Premier Sun Yat-sen and also now Premier Wen Jiabao also talk about democracy. 2 premiers, 100 years. That tells us the serious challenges China faces on the political front. Let me very quickly mention why political reform, as Professor Yu said, is a necessity rather than a choice. Because early on, the first panel, we talk about innovation. We talk about service sector. We also mention about soft power. Innovation economy requires freedom, free competition, media freedom, the spirit of freedom. The service sector requires instead of manufacturing, requires more on trust on the one hand and rule of law on the other hand. And finally, the soft power. As we know, American soft power largely based on civil society. In all these 3 areas, China needs to do fundamental change. That's why I agree with Professor Yu. Democracy, political reform, serious political reform is not something of a choice, but a necessity.
Thank you for that. Dazong Wang, I wanted to follow up quickly on one thing you raised, which I think is a very interesting question that relates to some of these problems of pressure for political change. You once worked for General Motors, which historically in the United States was a major private sector company for a little while after the financial crisis. Actually, GM also became a state-owned company. You had left it by then, but still, obviously, we think about it as being a private sector company. Now you've worked for a couple of the biggest state-owned companies in China, and as you mentioned in your comments, the biggest state-owned companies still very much occupy the kind of commanding heights. The biggest conglomerates, the largest listed companies on the stock market, some of the major investors abroad, obviously access to financing from government banks. And I think a lot of Americans are very interested in knowing what the prospects are for the private sector in China to become as big and powerful as the state sector is. Do you see that as an inevitable process of change, or do you see the state sector as kind of retaining those commanding heights of the economy for many years to come?
That's a good question, Joe. Before I answer your question, go back to Cheng Li's the 30% of college graduates couldn't get a job. Now, I don't know what year data was that. I know we have big problem getting people. Maybe our personnel people not getting resumes, We, in the last series, the last couple of years, we've been really short on people. Our capacity plans to be running over capacity. And the company right now is 60,000 people, will go up to 120,000 in 5 years. So we need a lot of the people and particularly the talent. Anyway, now go back to Joe's the question. That goes to the fundamentals.